I always believed that when this day finally arrived, the air would feel different. I thought it would be filled with lightness, with a sweetness that could only come after years of carrying a weight that nearly crushed me. For years, through every long night and every tear that fell onto my textbooks, I pictured this exact moment. I would walk across the stage with my gown swaying around my ankles, my cap slipping slightly on my head, my name echoing through the auditorium, and the faces of my family shining back at me from the audience. I dreamed of locking eyes with Nathan, of seeing my children clap with pride, of watching my parents smile in that way they had always reserved for my brother. But when my name was called, when my shoes clicked against the wooden steps leading to the stage, what I saw were 5 empty seats. 5 chairs in the 4th row, neatly aligned, decorated with blue ribbons marking them as reserved. I had claimed those seats half a year earlier, certain that my family would fill them. They were supposed to be the proof that everything I had done, every sacrifice and every sleepless night, had been for something. Instead, the sight of those ribbons fluttering in the air conditioning became a cruel reminder that even today, even on the day that was supposed to belong to me, they had chosen to be somewhere else. The dean smiled warmly as he placed the diploma case into my hands. The applause around me was deafening, yet none of it reached me. I smiled for the cameras, but my lips trembled. My eyes kept darting back to those 5 empty chairs as if I could will them into being filled. But the truth did not bend. My family had not come. As I stepped down from the stage, my legs felt heavy, like I was moving through quicksand. The sounds of joy surrounded me, families calling out to their graduates, flowers being passed forward, children clapping for their parents. Laughter and celebration filled every corner of the auditorium, but for me there was only silence. I sank into my seat, my diploma clutched against my chest, as though it could protect me from the hollowness blooming inside. When the ceremony ended, the courtyard outside turned into a sea of embraces. Mothers kissed their sons on the cheeks, fathers wrapped their daughters in bear hugs, children squealed as they posed for photos with their graduating parents. Balloons floated above the crowd, confetti clung to gowns, cameras flashed endlessly. Everywhere I turned, joy spilled over like champagne from an uncorked bottle. I stood in the middle of it all, invisible, holding my diploma case as though it were the only hand I had to hold. Then my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket, my heart leaping with a hope I refused to acknowledge. Maybe they had been stuck in traffic. Maybe there had been some emergency. Maybe they were on their way right now and would be waiting for me just outside. But when I opened the screen, my heart cracked. It was a message from Nathan. "Sorry we couldn't make it. Derek invited us last minute to his barbecue. The kids begged to go. We'll celebrate later at home." Just like that. No apology that carried the weight of regret. No acknowledgement of what this day meant to me. Just a casual explanation that my brother's barbecue had won their attention. I stared at the message until the words blurred. My throat burned. They had not simply forgotten. They had chosen not to be there. I wanted to scream. My brother's barbecue. His goddamn barbecue. Burgers and beers and his endless bragging about his new outdoor kitchen had mattered more than me, more than 5 years of sacrifice. More than the degree that was supposed to change all of our lives. I looked up and watched another graduate being lifted off her feet by her children, her husband kissing her temple as they laughed. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run, to hide from the shame of standing alone in a crowd that overflowed with love. In that moment, I felt the entire weight of my journey crash down on me. 5 years of waking at dawn to prepare lunches, of working full days at the firm, of rushing to night classes, of coming home past 9 with assignments still waiting. 5 years of living in a constant state of exhaustion, pushing through migraines, losing hair from stress, sacrificing weekends to study while Nathan took the kids to birthday parties. 5 years of overhearing Ethan complain that I was always studying, of Sophia asking why I could not just skip school one night to watch her recital, of Nathan's sighs when I fell asleep at the dinner table. I told myself it was all temporary. When I finally walked across that stage, they would see it had been worth it, that they would understand, that they would be proud. But now, standing in the courtyard with confetti at my feet and Nathan's text on my phone, I understood something I had spent my whole life avoiding. They were never going to give me what I craved. Not my husband, not my children, not my parents. Their absence spoke louder than any words, louder than any excuse my mother might give about flights being too expensive, louder than Nathan's half-hearted promise that we would celebrate later, louder than my children's pleading to go somewhere more fun. The truth was simple and devastating. I had never been enough for them, and maybe I never would be. A hot rage began to rise in me, curling around my ribs, filling my lungs. It was more than sadness. It was more than disappointment. It was the slow, searing realization that I had built my life around people who could not see me. People who would rather eat ribs at Derek's house than watch me grasp the degree I had nearly destroyed myself to earn. I wiped at my cheeks quickly before anyone could see. My diploma case dug into my arms as I held it closer. Around me, cameras clicked, laughter rang out, kisses were exchanged. But inside me, something else was being born. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, something sharper, something colder. Revenge. Not the reckless kind, not shouting or broken plates or slammed doors. Mine would be quiet, deliberate, unshakable. The kind of revenge that forces people to watch you rise higher than they ever imagined, knowing they played no part in it. The kind that haunts them every time they remember the empty seats they left behind. That day was supposed to mark the end of a long chapter of sacrifice and struggle. Instead, it marked the beginning of something entirely different. The Alicia who begged for love, who bent herself into painful shapes for approval, who endured neglect and called it family, ended on that stage. The woman who walked away from the courtyard that afternoon was not the same. She was broken, yes. But broken pieces can be sharp, and I intended to make sure every single one of them would cut. When people talk about graduate school, they often describe it as a choice, an investment in the future, a step toward bigger opportunities. For me, it was never just a choice. It was survival. I had been stuck for years in the same position at Franklin Financial, watching younger men with less experience leapfrog over me into promotions that should have been mine. Every year during performance reviews, my boss smiled and told me I was competent, dependable, hardworking, but without a master's degree, I was not management material. After the third time I was passed over, I realized I could either accept a lifetime of being overlooked or I could drag myself towards something better. So I enrolled. 5 years of night classes, a mountain of tuition fees, and the kind of schedule that devours a person whole. I told myself it was worth it. That was how I justified the sacrifices that began to eat away at every corner of my life. The mornings started before sunrise. I would stumble out of bed at 5:30, already exhausted, to pack lunches for the kids, iron Nathan's shirts, and scribble notes for the day ahead. By the time I clocked in at the office, my brain already felt frayed. My days were filled with endless spreadsheets, financial models, and demanding clients. When evening came, instead of resting, I drove across town, sitting in classrooms under fluorescent lights until 9 at night. I returned home to dishes in the sink, homework spread across the table, and a husband already drifting into sleep. And then I would open my laptop again, forcing myself to write papers until the clock blinked 1, sometimes 2 in the morning. At first, Nathan said he understood. He picked up the slack, making dinner a few nights a week, driving the kids to soccer practice. He even left notes on the counter telling me how proud he was, but patience has an expiration date and his ran out faster than I expected. Soon the notes disappeared. His sighs grew louder. His questions became sharper. How much longer is this going to take? The kids barely see you anymore. Are you sure this is worth it? Every time he asked, I answered with the same promises. Just 2 more years. Just 1 more semester. Just a few more months. I clung to those timelines like lifelines, but each deadline stretched into another, and Nathan's smile faded with every extension. The children felt it too. Ethan, entering those stormy teenage years, decided it was easier to resent me than to understand me. He rolled his eyes when I left for class, muttered complaints about how I cared more about my books than about him. I once overheard him whisper to Nathan, "Mom never has time for us anymore." The words pierced me more deeply than he could have imagined. Sophia tried to be gentler, still running to hug me when I returned home, but even she began to pull away, her little face clouded with disappointment when I missed her piano recital. And then there were my parents. I called them early in the program, proud to share that I had enrolled, expecting even a small cheer of encouragement. My mother's voice had been flat. "That sounds like a lot of work, dear. Are you sure you want to put yourself through that? Your brother Derek just bought a new property, did I tell you? He says it will be his most successful flip yet." I had learned long ago that Derek's triumphs always outshone mine, but even then the sting remained. The favoritism was not new. As children, Derek was the golden boy, the athlete, the charmer. My parents attended every one of his football games, waving banners, shouting themselves hoarse. For me, there were science fairs, spelling bees debate competitions. They missed more of them than I could count. Mom once told me, "You are always so serious, Alicia. Your brother is just more fun to be around." I laughed it off, but inside, it hollowed me. As the years of my degree dragged on, I became less a member of my family and more a ghost haunting its edges. Nathan and the kids developed their own routines that did not include me. Weekend outings happened without my presence. Vacations were postponed because I needed the time for coursework. I told myself it was temporary, but temporary has a way of stretching into permanence when no one else believes in the finish line. There were nights when my body betrayed me. My chest tightened from stress, my temples pounded with headaches that made light unbearable. Twice I fainted, once in the office bathroom, once at the kitchen counter while grading practice exams. Both times Nathan scolded me for pushing too hard. Both times I nodded, promised to slow down, and went right back to work. Because if I stopped, everything I had sacrificed would be meaningless. What hurt most was not the exhaustion, not even the loneliness. It was the way everyone around me treated my dream as an inconvenience, as though I had chosen to abandon them out of selfishness rather than striving to create a better future for all of us. I imagined the day of graduation as the cure. The moment when all those absences, all those dinners skipped, all those late nights would finally make sense to them. They would see me in cap and gown, diploma in hand, and understand. That hope kept me moving. It became the fuel that lit my steps when my body wanted to collapse. It became the lullaby I whispered to myself when the house slept and I faced another mountain of assignments. It became the picture I clung to when my parents brushed me aside or when Nathan's eyes hardened with disappointment. Graduation day was going to be my redemption, but as the years passed, my vision of that day grew desperate. I began to prepare months in advance, terrified that if I did not plan every detail, it would fall apart like so many promises before. I reserved the tickets the moment they were available. I bought my parents a hotel room so travel would not be an excuse. I called my sister Melissa and begged her to come. I even booked a restaurant for the celebration afterward, spending more than I should have because I wanted it perfect. For once, I wanted the story of my life to end with laughter and applause instead of silence. I should have known better. By the final semester, Nathan barely spoke about it. When I reminded him of the date, he only nodded. The kids shrugged. My parents sounded distracted on the phone. Only Melissa promised with genuine excitement that she would be there. I clung to her words like a lifeline. But the closer the day came, the heavier the dread in my chest grew. It was like watching storm clouds gather over a picnic you had planned for months, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop the rain. And still, I hoped. That hope carried me through the endless rehearsals of how the day would unfold. I imagined Sophia's arms around my waist, Ethan's reluctant grin, Nathan's hand squeezing mine. I imagined my parents' eyes finally softening, finally seeing me. Instead, I walked across the stage to blue ribbons on empty chairs. Sometimes I wonder if I lost those 5 years completely, as though someone had taken a blade and sliced them out of my life. I was there, of course, but I was not living. I was surviving, moving on autopilot from one obligation to the next, hoping the exhaustion would not kill me before the degree was in my hands. There were nights when I returned home and found the house dark except for the flicker of the television. Nathan would be slouched on the couch, half asleep, the kids tucked into bed hours earlier. I would stand in the hallway for a moment, clutching my bag, wondering when exactly my home had stopped feeling like mine. Sometimes Nathan stirred and looked at me, and in his eyes there was not pride or love but irritation, as though my very presence was a reminder of how much he carried in my absence. Other times he did not even notice I had come home. I would slip into the bedroom, shower quickly, crawl into bed, and listen to the sound of his steady breathing while my own mind raced through assignments still undone. Even in sleep, I felt alone. The loneliness was sharper on weekends. I would sit at the kitchen table surrounded by books and notes, while outside the window I could see Nathan loading the car with the kids, heading off to soccer games, to birthday parties, to family barbecues. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that someday I would be able to join them again, that this was temporary. But the truth was that every time they drove away without me, a part of me stayed behind, waving goodbye in silence. The irony was cruel. I had chosen this path because I wanted to give them more. I wanted a better job, a higher income, stability for Ethan and Sophia's futures. Yet in chasing that dream, I was losing them. And they could not understand that I was doing it for them, not against them. The cracks spread in ways I could not mend. Ethan stopped asking for my help with homework. He went to Nathan instead, or to his friends, and soon his bedroom door was always closed. Sophia grew quieter, her hugs shorter, her questions fewer. When I did manage to join them at dinner, conversation flowed between Nathan and the kids while I sat silent, too tired to form words, too out of sync to belong. I tried to bridge the distance. I left notes in Ethan's backpack, small drawings in Sophia's lunchbox. I arranged surprise outings, only to cancel them when exams loomed. I forced myself to smile through my exhaustion, to ask about their days even when my mind was buried in financial theory. But no matter how hard I tried, I always seemed to be one step behind, chasing after a family that was learning to live without me. And then there were my parents. They came to visit once during my 3rd year. I cleaned the house obsessively, cooked a meal despite my deadlines, hoping to impress them. At dinner, my father asked about Derek's latest project before he asked about my classes. My mother praised Nathan for managing so well with the children. They barely acknowledged the stack of papers and textbooks spread across the living room. By the time they left, I felt smaller than when they had arrived. It was during those years that I began to feel my body revolt. The headaches grew worse, pounding like drums behind my eyes. My stomach knotted with stress until meals turned into chores. Some nights I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, hollow cheeks, dull eyes, wondering who that woman was. She looked like a stranger, someone drained of color and joy. I pressed my palms against the sink, whispering to myself that it would all be worth it, that the woman in the mirror was temporary, that the future Alicia would thank me. The only person who seemed to believe in me was my sister Melissa. She called often, checking in, sending small care packages with tea, notebooks, little notes of encouragement. She told me over and over that she was proud of me, that I was doing something brave. Her words were lifelines. When the weight of silence from the rest of the family threatened to drown me, Melissa's voice reminded me that I was not completely invisible. As the program stretched toward its end, I held onto graduation day like it was oxygen. I imagined it over and over, building it in my mind until it became a glowing beacon. Every sacrifice, every absence, every disappointment would melt away when I walked across that stage and saw my family cheering. They would finally understand. They would finally see me. I reserved those seats with trembling hands, as though securing them would guarantee their presence. I sent reminders to Nathan, to the kids, to my parents. I booked the restaurant. I even bought a new dress for Sophia and a tie for Ethan, imagining how they would look in the photos. I rehearsed the moment in my mind so many times it felt inevitable. But inevitability is an illusion, because when the day came, all I saw were 5 empty chairs. The final semester came with a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. My body felt like it had been hollowed out, but my mind clung desperately to the thought that the end was near. I counted down the weeks like a prisoner marking days on a wall. Every lecture, every exam, every late night bent over my computer brought me closer to the finish line. I told myself that everything would change once I graduated. Nathan would remember the woman he had married, the kids would forgive the missed recitals and soccer games, my parents would finally look at me and see more than just the daughter who was always too serious. Graduation day would heal the distance that had grown between us, so I planned. I sent the invitations, I booked the restaurant, I begged for promises that they would be there. Nathan agreed with little more than a shrug. The kids mumbled, "Okay." My parents gave vague answers that I forced myself to believe. On the night before the ceremony, I laid out my gown and cap on the bed. I ran my hands across the fabric, imagining the moment when I would wear it, imagining Sophia's squeal of excitement, Ethan's reluctant grin, Nathan's proud eyes, my parents' approving nods. I whispered to myself that it was going to be perfect, but deep down, a small voice inside me whispered another truth. It told me that I was setting myself up for disappointment, that I was trusting people who had shown me, again and again, that I could not rely on them. I silenced that voice, clung to hope, and fell asleep with the image of 5 smiling faces in my mind. The next day, I walked across the stage to find only 5 empty seats. And with that, the years I had given away in sacrifice collapsed into silence. The morning after graduation, the house felt colder than it ever had before. The cap and gown still hung on the back of the chair in our bedroom, but to Nathan and the kids, it was just another piece of laundry waiting to be put away. They had come home late from Derek's barbecue, the smell of grilled meat still clinging to their clothes, their laughter echoing as though the day before had not meant anything at all. No one asked me how it felt to walk across that stage. No one even looked at the diploma lying on the dining table. I waited for Nathan to say something. I waited for him to notice that I was quieter than usual, that my smile had cracked. But he simply kissed the top of my head in passing, poured his coffee, and started talking about the new project Derek had told him about. My children followed his lead, chattering about the barbecue, who had been there, what games they had played. The entire morning passed without a single mention of my graduation. Something inside me hardened. I had always told myself that my sacrifices would be worth it if my family could be proud of me in the end. But now I realized that pride was never theirs to give. I had been starving for scraps of recognition from people who had never intended to feed me. The truth hit me like a blade sliding between ribs. They would never see me, not unless I forced them to. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I no longer wanted their approval. What I wanted was for them to regret every time they had chosen not to stand by me. That thought was terrifying at first. Revenge had never been a word I allowed myself to think. I was the good daughter, the loyal wife, the mother who endured. But the longer I sat in that kitchen, surrounded by the hum of their conversations about anything but me, the more the words settled into me like a seed planted in fertile ground. In the days that followed, I began to change, though at first no one noticed. I stopped begging for their attention. I stopped waiting at the dinner table for them to ask about my day. Instead, I poured my energy into myself. I joined a fitness program, not because Nathan suggested it or because I wanted to look a certain way, but because my body was a battlefield I intended to reclaim. Each morning I laced my shoes, ran until my lungs burned, and told myself that every drop of sweat was a piece of the old Alicia leaving me. At work, I no longer shrank into the background. The degree in my hands was more than paper, it was leverage. I volunteered for projects, spoke up in meetings, and pushed myself into spaces where I had once been told I did not belong. My boss, the same man who had passed me over for promotions, began to look at me differently. Within months, I was offered a new position, one that gave me authority and visibility. For the first time, I felt the world shifting in my favor, not because anyone had handed me a place, but because I had taken it. At home, my silence spoke louder than arguments. When Nathan complained that I was too busy again, I simply smiled and continued. When the kids demanded my time but dismissed my accomplishments, I gave them what I could but no longer bled myself dry for their approval. My parents called less and less, and when they did, I answered with polite distance. The absence that had once hollowed me out now became a shield. But beneath it all, the spark of revenge burned hotter. Every new achievement, every compliment from colleagues, every step I took toward building a life that was truly mine, I imagined them watching. I imagined Nathan realizing that the woman he had taken for granted was slipping away from him. I imagined my children one day looking back and seeing how much they had underestimated their mother. I imagined my parents, so quick to boast about Derek, being forced to hear my name from other people's lips. I did not need to shout my anger. I would let my success become the silence that haunted them. The shift in me grew so strong that even Melissa noticed. One evening, she called and said, "You sound different, Alicia. Stronger, like you finally stopped waiting for them." I smiled for the first time in days. She was right. I had stopped waiting, yet beneath the strength there was still pain. I would not lie to myself about that. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aching for the warmth of the family I had wanted them to be. I cried into my pillow, mourning the years I had given away. But each time I wiped my tears, I reminded myself that mourning was temporary, but revenge could last a lifetime. I began to keep a journal, something I had not done since I was a teenager. On its first page, I wrote, "They left my seats empty. I will fill them with everything they chose to ignore." And I wrote every night, cataloging not my pain, but my progress. Every run, every project at work, every compliment I earned went into that journal. It became a record not of who I had been, but of who I was becoming. Weeks turned into months, and I felt myself sharpening. My laughter returned, not for them, but for me. My body grew stronger. My mind, once fogged with exhaustion, grew sharper with clarity. And all the while, the memory of those empty seats followed me, not as a wound anymore, but as fuel. I promised myself something then. One day, Nathan, the kids, my parents, even Derek would look at me and remember the choice they made. One day, those empty seats would haunt them as they haunted me, and that promise was enough to keep the fire alive. Success does not arrive with trumpets or banners. It slips in quietly, changing the air in ways only you can feel at first. That is how it was for me. Months after my graduation, while my family went on living as though nothing had happened, the ground beneath my feet began to shift. At work, my new role came with responsibilities that terrified me at first. I oversaw a team of 6 analysts, most of them younger and brimming with confidence. Once, I would have shrunk back, let louder voices take the stage. But I was done shrinking. I prepared obsessively, studied their reports, learned to anticipate their questions. And slowly, they began to look at me differently. They trusted me. They respected me. Even my boss, who had so often overlooked me, called me into his office one afternoon and said, "You've grown into this role faster than anyone expected." Those words stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit, not because I needed his approval, but because they confirmed what I already knew. I was no longer invisible. The changes in me were not just professional. My body was transforming too. The morning runs grew longer. The fatigue that had once weighed on me like chains began to lift. My skin, once dull, gained a glow I had forgotten it could hold. The mirror no longer reflected a stranger. It reflected a woman who was alive again. People noticed. At the office, colleagues complimented my energy, my style. Strangers smiled at me in coffee shops. Even Melissa teased me, saying I sounded happier, lighter. I laughed with her, but deep down, I knew it was not happiness alone. It was the quiet satisfaction of building a life that no one else could take credit for. At home, however, the air grew tense. Nathan watched me with puzzled eyes, as though he could not place who I was becoming. When I left for early morning runs, he frowned and asked if I was trying to prove something. When I stayed late at work to finish a project, he muttered that I was obsessed. But there was an edge to his voice that I recognized. It was not concern, it was fear. For years, he had grown comfortable with me being tired, dependent, stretched thin. He had learned to expect me to apologize for not being enough. But now, I no longer apologized. I no longer asked for permission. I no longer explained myself. And that unsettled him more than any argument could. The children noticed too. Ethan, once dismissive, now hesitated before rolling his eyes. When I showed up to one of his soccer games, standing tall at the sidelines, cheering with a voice that carried across the field, I saw the flicker of surprise in his face. Sophia clung to me more often, watching closely as if trying to understand this new version of her mother. They did not say much, but I could feel the shift. They were beginning to realize that the woman they had overlooked was not waiting in the shadows anymore. And then there were my parents. They had heard of my promotion through Melissa, who never missed a chance to brag about me. My mother called one afternoon, her tone unusually soft. "We're proud of you, Alicia," she said, almost awkwardly, as though the words were foreign in her mouth. I thanked her, but inside I felt nothing. Their pride arrived too late. It was like rain falling on a garden that had already withered. Still, I smiled politely, because revenge, I realized, was not about shouting back. It was about letting them watch as the silence they had left me with turned into the silence of their own regret. The turning point came during a company gala. I was invited as part of the leadership team, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I wore a deep emerald dress that Melissa helped me choose, the kind that hugged me in all the right places and made me feel powerful. As I stepped into the ballroom, I saw heads turn. For the first time in years, I was not Alicia, the tired wife or the invisible daughter. I was Alicia, the woman who had rebuilt herself from ashes. That night, I spoke with executives, laughed with colleagues, even danced once. Cameras flashed, and photos later appeared in the company newsletter. When Nathan saw them, his expression was unreadable. He asked me why I had not invited him to the gala. I looked at him calmly and said, "Because you didn't want to come to my graduation." The silence that followed was heavier than any fight we had ever had. In that silence, I understood something vital. Revenge was not a single act. It was not one dramatic confrontation. It was a process, a slow unveiling of strength until those who underestimated you could no longer ignore it. And every day, with every choice I made for myself, I was carving that revenge into reality. But the sweetest part was still to come. Because the higher I rose, the more they would be forced to see what they had abandoned. The empty seats at my graduation were only the beginning. Soon, the world would know my name, and they would have no choice but to remember the day they chose to stay away. There is a strange kind of silence that comes after victory. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of power, the heavy calm that follows when you know the tides have finally shifted in your favor. That silence filled my life 2 years after graduation. By then, my promotion had turned into a series of promotions, and my name was no longer confined to a corner office. It appeared in emails that circulated across the firm, in industry panels where I was invited to speak, in awards given to women who had risen against odds. I had built something no one could take away from me. My body was stronger, my mind sharper, my spirit steady. For the first time, I was not running on fumes, not desperate for scraps of recognition. I was whole. And people noticed. The first to notice was Nathan. One evening, he came home earlier than usual, carrying flowers. I was at the dining table, reviewing a proposal that would soon land me in a national financial magazine. He placed the bouquet in front of me with an awkward smile, as though he was trying to remember how to be charming. "You've been working so hard," he said. "I thought you deserved these." A part of me wanted to laugh. Flowers. After years of silence, of absence, of choosing barbecues over my milestones, he thought he could buy his way back into my heart with a bundle of roses. But I only smiled politely, thanked him, and placed the flowers in a vase. The gesture hung between us, fragile, desperate. From that day on, he tried harder. He asked about my work, offered to help with dinner, suggested we go on dates like we used to. But the more he tried, the clearer it became. His efforts were not born of love. They were born of fear. He saw me rising, saw others admiring me, and realized that the balance of our marriage had shifted. I was no longer the tired, invisible wife. I was someone others wanted to stand beside, and that terrified him. His jealousy leaked out in small ways. If I dressed elegantly for a work event, he would frown and ask, "Who are you trying to impress?" If a colleague texted me in the evening, he would mutter, "You're always so busy for us." The irony was sharp. For years, he had been content to live without me, to let me fade into exhaustion. Now that I had color in my cheeks and fire in my voice again, he wanted to put me back in the shadows. The children followed in his wake, but their approach was softer. Ethan, now a young man preparing for college, began asking me for advice. He wanted help with applications, recommendations, and guidance on interviews. One night, he knocked on my door with his laptop in hand and said almost sheepishly, "Mom, can you look over my essay? I want it to sound strong, like yours always do." I stared at him for a moment, my heart caught between pride and bitterness. He had spent years brushing off my presence, mocking my textbooks, dismissing my sacrifices. Now he wanted me to shape his words. I helped him, of course. I am his mother, and the instinct to guide him has never left me, but the irony did not escape me. He was turning to me only now when he needed something. Sophia was gentler. She began hovering in the kitchen while I cooked, asking small questions about my work, about the people I met. Sometimes she borrowed my clothes, sneaking into my closet to try on shoes that were still too big for her. She clung to me more often, hugged me longer, as though she was afraid I might slip away. They were beginning to realize that the woman they had overlooked was not waiting in the shadows anymore. And then came my parents. It started with a phone call. My mother's voice was unusually bright. "Your father and I were talking," she said, "and we think it would be wonderful if you came to Derek's 4th of July party this year. You could tell everyone about your work. He's so proud of you, Alicia." I nearly dropped the phone. Derek was proud of me. Derek, who had never once called me to ask about my studies, who had always been the golden child in their eyes, now apparently admired me. My parents, who had skipped my graduation to sit in his backyard, now wanted me to stand in that same backyard and be paraded as their successful daughter. I told her I would think about it, then hung up. My hands shook as I set the phone down. In the weeks that followed, the invitations multiplied. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthdays I had not been invited to in years. They bragged about me to their friends, sent clippings of my articles to relatives, told anyone who would listen how proud they had always been of me. Melissa told me once that our mother had even said, "We always knew Alicia would do something great." When Melissa repeated that, I laughed until tears streamed down my face. Always knew? No. They had doubted me at every turn, dismissed me, compared me to Derek. Their sudden pride was not born of faith. It was born of convenience. The world now admired me, and they wanted to stand in that light. For the first time in my life, I held the upper hand. I had begged for their approval for decades. Now they begged for mine, but with power came questions. Did I want to let them back in? To open my arms to the very people who had left me standing alone on the most important day of my life? Or was the sweeter revenge in keeping them at arm's length, letting them watch but never letting them touch? The answer shifted each day. Some mornings, when Sophia leaned her head on my shoulder, I thought about forgiveness, about breaking the cycle of bitterness before it consumed us all. Other mornings, when I remembered standing under the bright lights of graduation with 5 empty seats staring back at me, I wanted to lock the door forever. Nathan pressed hardest. He suggested therapy, weekend getaways, whispered late at night that he still loved me. But I could see the cracks in his words, the way his eyes darted when he mentioned my growing reputation. He was not afraid of losing me to unhappiness. He was afraid of losing me to independence. My parents were subtler but just as transparent. My father began calling me our pride and joy. My mother sent gifts, scarves, books, trinkets she thought would please me. But every gesture was stained by years of absence. They had chosen Derek's barbecue over my diploma. They had chosen silence over support. Now their voices sounded hollow, like an echo in an empty hall. The turning point came during a gala where I was awarded Financial Leader of the Year. My firm flew me to New York, put me in a hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Cameras flashed as I accepted the award, and the applause thundered around me. In that crowd, I saw faces of people who had believed in me, colleagues, mentors, strangers who admired my journey. What I did not see were the people who had left 5 seats empty. Later that night, Nathan called. His voice was thick with something he could not name. "I saw the live stream," he said. "You looked incredible. I wish I'd been there with you." I closed my eyes, the memory of my graduation burning behind my eyelids, and I whispered back, "So do I," then I hung up. Because that was the truth. I had wished once. I had wished for him, for my children, for my parents. I had wished so hard it broke me, but wishing had got me nothing but empty chairs, and now the time for wishing was over. The time for consequences had begun. From that night forward, I made my choice. I would not slam doors or scream or burn bridges. My revenge would remain what it had always been: quiet, undeniable success. I would let them into the periphery of my life, but never its center. I would smile politely, share pieces of my story, but never again would I hand them the power to define me. They could watch. They could long. They could regret it, but they would never again sit in the front row of my life. And every time they remembered those 5 empty seats, they would know that it was their choice, not mine. I used to believe that revenge was fire. I pictured it as flames that licked at the edges of everything, consuming, destroying, roaring so loud that it left no doubt behind. I thought one day I would scream at them, throw their betrayals back into their faces, demand an apology that had been denied to me for years. I thought revenge was about noise. But standing at the height of everything I had built, I realized I had been wrong. Revenge is not fire. It is ice. Cold, steady, unshakable. It does not roar. It does not announce itself. It simply exists, undeniable and permanent. 3 years had passed since my graduation. In those years, I had climbed further than I had ever imagined. My diploma, once dismissed by my family, had become the key that opened door after door. I had been promoted, not once, but 3 times. My name appeared in magazines, in interviews, in professional forums where people sought my opinion. I was invited to speak at panels, to share my story with women who wanted to carve out paths like mine. I had become someone I once only dreamed of being. And the most liberating part was this: I had done it without them. I had learned to love myself again. My body no longer ached from exhaustion but thrummed with strength. My mind was not clouded with doubt but sharp, capable, decisive. My heart, though scarred, had found peace in knowing that I no longer lived for the approval of people who had once left me alone. And then, just as tides always return to shore, they all came back. Nathan was the first. He became attentive in ways I had once begged for. He came home earlier. He cooked dinner. He left sticky notes on the fridge that said things like, "Good luck on your meeting today," or "Don't forget to smile." He texted in the middle of the day with words I used to ache to hear, "Thinking of you." But I was not fooled. His timing betrayed him. He had not been absent by accident. He had chosen absence again and again. Where was this man when I was drowning in textbooks at midnight, whispering to myself that it was all worth it? Where was he when I stood on stage with my diploma and looked out to see 5 empty chairs? His gestures now felt less like love and more like fear. Fear of losing me to a world where I no longer needed him. His jealousy surfaced in small ways. When I dressed elegantly for a work gala, he asked, "Who are you trying to impress?" When colleagues emailed me at night, he muttered, "You're always so busy for us." The irony was sharp enough to cut. For years he had been content with my absence, content to fill his time with others while I fought to build a future. Now that I was visible, now that others admired me, he could not bear it. The children were different. Ethan, grown now, sent me a letter from his dorm room. He thanked me for helping him with his college essays, for teaching him how to fight for what he wanted. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he wrote at the end. Those words, so simple, so ordinary, pierced me. I had waited my whole life to hear them. but they arrived years too late, after silence, after eye rolls, after dismissive comments. Still, I kept the letter in my drawer. Not because I forgave everything, but because it was proof that maybe, just maybe, he had begun to understand. Sophia was softer. She followed me into the kitchen when I cooked, asking questions about my work, about the people I met. She sat on the couch with me at night, curled up against my arm as if she feared I might disappear. She wanted to borrow my clothes, try on my shoes, mimic my habits. She looked at me with wide eyes, the kind that whispered admiration without words. She was young enough to change, young enough to learn that love meant showing up. For her, I let my guard down more often. But my parents were relentless. They began inviting me to dinners where I was the guest of honor. They introduced me to family friends with pride, as though they had always seen my potential. They told anyone who would listen how much they had believed in me, how certain they had been that I would succeed. They even sent clippings of my interviews to relatives, underlining my name as if to claim me as their own creation. The hypocrisy burned. For decades, they had chosen Derek. They had stood in his backyard while I walked across a stage alone. They had doubted me, belittled me, overlooked me. And now, with the world praising me, they wanted to rewrite history. They wanted to stand in the glow of my success as though they had earned it. I let them talk. I let them perform. But inside, I carried the truth like armor. Their pride was not for me. It was for themselves. The final test came one evening when Nathan suggested we renew our vows. He had cooked my favorite meal, set the table with candles, tried to recreate intimacy long gone. After dinner, he took my hands in his eyes soft with desperation. "I think we should start fresh," he said. "A new chapter. Renew our vows, just you and me." For a moment, I simply stared at him. His words hung in the air, heavy and hollow. I thought of the night I had stood in my graduation gown, waiting, believing he would arrive at the last moment to surprise me. I thought of the rows of seats I had reserved, 5 names written carefully on the cards, and how those seats had remained painfully empty. I pulled my hands away gently. "Nathan," I said quietly, "you left me alone on the most important day of my life. You all did. Do you think a ceremony can change that?" His face crumpled. For once, he had no words. That was when I understood something profound. Revenge was not about punishing them. It was about refusing to let them rewrite the story. They had abandoned me when it mattered most. That was the truth. And no flowers, no dinners, no vows would ever erase it. From that moment, I made my choice. I would not rage. I would not slam doors. My revenge would remain what it had always been: quiet, undeniable success. I would allow them into the periphery of my life, but never again would I give them the center. Never again would their presence or absence dictate my worth. Months later, I was invited to deliver the keynote speech at a national women's leadership conference. The auditorium was massive, a sea of faces stretching into the horizon. As I stepped onto the stage, applause thundered around me. The sound filled me, lifted me, and for a fleeting moment, I felt those 5 empty seats again. But this time, they did not hurt. They empowered me. I began my speech with a story. I told the audience about a woman who had walked across a graduation stage with 5 reserved seats waiting for her family. I told them how those seats had remained empty, how the silence had nearly broken her. And then I told them how she had built a life from that silence, brick by brick, until the applause of strangers replaced the absence of her loved ones. As I spoke, I saw tears in the eyes of women across the room. Some nodded, some clutched their notebooks tighter, some whispered to each other. By the time I finished, the audience was on their feet, clapping, cheering, crying. The noise washed over me, filling every hollow corner those empty seats had carved years ago. And I realized then that those 5 empty seats had not been a curse. They had been a gift. They had forced me to stand on my own, to rise, to become the woman I was always meant to be. The sweetest revenge is not proving them wrong. It is proving yourself right. It is living so fully, so unapologetically, that those who doubted you must live forever with the knowledge that they missed their chance to stand beside you. When I stepped off the stage, my phone buzzed with messages. Nathan, my parents, even Derek. Their words blurred together: pride, admiration, love, regret. I read them once, then slid the phone into my bag, because I did not need their words anymore. I had filled the seats of my life with people who truly saw me, who clapped because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated. Friends, colleagues, mentors, strangers who became allies. My front row was no longer empty. It was overflowing. And as I walked out of that auditorium, my head high, my heart steady, I whispered to myself the words that had carried me all this way. They left my seats empty. I filled them with everything they ignored. And that is enough. 10 years have passed since the day I walked across a stage in a navy blue gown, clutching my diploma with trembling hands, staring at 5 empty seats that no one I loved had bothered to fill. A decade sounds like a lifetime, yet sometimes it feels like only yesterday that the sting of abandonment cut through me sharper than the cheers of the crowd. But the truth is, 10 years have given me a distance I once thought impossible. Those 5 empty seats are still a part of me, but they no longer wound me. They remind me of where I began, of what I chose to build in the silence. I am 48 now, though I feel younger, lighter than I did at 35. Back then, my body ached constantly, my eyes burned with exhaustion, and my spirit carried the weight of invisible chains. Today, I woke up before dawn, lace up my running shoes, and chase the rising sun along the shoreline. My lungs fill with salt air, my legs burn with effort, and I laugh sometimes as I run, because this body, this life, belongs entirely to me now. My home sits high on a hill, with glass windows that catch the first light of morning and spill it into every corner. There are plants I nurture, books stacked on every surface, photographs of places I have traveled, faces of friends who became family. The silence inside these walls is no longer hollow. It is peaceful. It is mine. My career grew beyond what I once thought possible. I sit on the board of the firm that gave me my first chance. My name is spoken in rooms I never dreamed I would enter. I have given speeches in cities I once only read about: New York, London, Tokyo, Sydney. I stand before crowds of women, men, young students, seasoned professionals, and I tell them the truth of my story. I tell them about the woman who stood alone at her own graduation. I tell them about 5 empty seats. And I tell them how those empty seats became the foundation of everything I built. Sometimes, when I am on stage, I see tears in the eyes of strangers. Afterward, they line up to meet me, their voices trembling as they say, "You gave me courage. You made me believe I can keep going." And every single time, I am humbled, because I know what it feels like to sit in despair, to think no one sees you, to believe you are invisible. To know that my story lights a spark in someone else is the greatest victory I could have ever imagined. But of course, the people who once abandoned me are still part of my life in their own ways. Nathan and I divorced 6 years ago. The end came quietly, not with fireworks or fury, but with resignation. One morning, I looked at him across the breakfast table, the silence between us heavy and final, and I realized we no longer shared the same life. I had grown into someone he did not recognize, and he had remained someone I could no longer love. We parted with politeness, even kindness. He remarried 2 years later to a woman who, by all appearances, adores him. I wish them well. We speak occasionally about the children, about holidays or logistics, but the bond we once had has dissolved into something civil and distant. Sometimes I wonder if he regrets more than he admits. Sometimes I think he does, but that is no longer my concern. Ethan is 27 now. He works in technology, building things with lines of code that I only vaguely understand. He calls me often, sometimes with questions about life, sometimes simply to hear my voice. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he says often, and every time those words wash over me, I remember the years I longed to hear them. The scar of his absence during my journey has not vanished, but it has softened. He has grown into a man who shows up, who understands the cost of silence, and I take comfort in knowing he carries that lesson into his own relationships. Sophia, my youngest, is 24, and she is my companion in ways I never expected. She studied finance for a time, inspired perhaps by me, but later she turned toward architecture, saying with a grin, "You build people, Mom, I'll build houses." Her designs are bold, filled with light and strength, and when she shows me her work, her eyes sparkle the way mine once did when I dreamed of something bigger. We travel together when our schedules align, exploring cities, tasting new foods, laughing late into the night. She introduces me to her friends by saying, "This is my mother." She's the strongest woman I know. No award, no title, no recognition will ever compare to that. My parents are older now. Age has slowed them, softened them. Their words wobble sometimes with regret. They call more often, their voices weaker than I remember. "We're so proud of you," my mother says, as though she has always said it. Sometimes, when the courage strikes her, she adds, "We should have been there." The first time she said it, her hands trembled around a napkin at the dinner table. I looked at her for a long time before nodding, but I did not answer. Forgiveness has never fully bloomed, but anger has withered too. I have learned that some wounds never heal completely. They stop bleeding, but the scars remain. I visit when I can, out of duty, not out of longing. And I leave each time with the same quiet peace. I no longer need their approval. There are still nights when I dream of that stage, of the confetti falling, of the roar of strangers clapping while my eyes searched desperately for the faces I loved. But when I wake, I no longer cry. I roll out of bed, pour coffee into my favorite mug, and remind myself of how far I have come. The pain is part of me, but it no longer rules me. I have filled the seats of my life with people who deserve them. Friends who listen, colleagues who celebrate, mentors who believed. Young women who look at me as proof that silence can be transformed into strength. My front row is no longer empty. It overflows. 10 years later, revenge no longer feels like revenge. It feels like freedom. The sweetest victory was never about punishing those who left me. It was about proving to myself that I was always worthy, that I did not need them to validate my existence, that their silence was not the end of my story, it was the beginning. If I could go back to that night after graduation, if I could whisper into the ear of the woman who stood in her gown with tears burning behind her smile, I would tell her this. They will not come, but you will rise anyway. You will build a life so radiant, so undeniable, that the world will clap louder than their silence ever could. And one day, you will understand that their absence did not break you. It made you. And perhaps that is the truest revenge of all. Not fire, not fury, not even forgiveness, but the quiet knowledge that I am free.